Most people think a flat stomach comes from doing enough crunches, more reps, more sets. Eventually, the muscle underneath just shows through. But here's the thing. The real story of a flat, tight-looking midsection has almost nothing to do with the muscle everyone's been training this whole time, and everything to do with a much deeper muscle most people have never deliberately engaged in their entire life. Stick with me here because I want to walk through the real mechanism carefully, then give you a complete practical protocol. Let's talk about your transverse abdominis. Your abdominal wall isn't a single muscle, it's several distinct layers stacked on top of each other. The one everyone trains with crunches, the rectus abdominis, sits right on the surface. It's the muscle responsible for that visible six-pack look when body fat is low enough to reveal it underneath. But beneath that, wrapping around your entire midsection like a natural corset, sits the transverse abdominis, and this deep muscle is actually responsible for something crunches barely touch at all, controlling your waist circumference and internal abdominal pressure moment to moment throughout the day. Here's what happens when this deep muscle is weak or rarely engaged, which describes most people who exclusively do crunches or sit-ups as their core training. Your abdominal wall loses its natural cinching tension, allowing your internal organs and abdominal contents to push outward against a looser wall, creating that pooch or bulge, even in people who aren't carrying much visible fat at all. A lower back that feels less supported and more prone to discomfort, since the transverse abdominis works alongside your deep spinal stabilizers in coordinated fashion. That frustrating experience of doing hundreds of crunches over months without your waistline actually looking any different than when you started. Sound familiar? Most people respond by doing even more crunches, assuming they just need more reps or more intensity to see results. And here's the problem with that approach. Crunches primarily work the rectus abdominis through spinal flexion, bending your torso forward repeatedly. That's a genuinely useful muscle to train, but it does almost nothing to address the transverse abdominis specifically, which requires a completely different type of engagement, one based on pressure and bracing rather than movement and repeated flexion. Okay, here's the good news. There's a specific 5-minute exercise that directly targets this deep corset muscle, and it works through a mechanism entirely different from anything crunches provide. Ready? Let's get into it. The key concept here is intra-abdominal pressure regulation. Here's the analogy I like to use. Think of your abdominal wall like a corset that can be laced either loosely or snugly. Crunches are like doing curls with the fabric of that corset, working the front panel specifically, but never actually tightening the laces themselves. The transverse abdominis is the actual lacing mechanism, and when it's properly engaged and strong, it cinches your entire midsection inward, creating that flatter, more contained appearance, regardless of how developed your surface rectus abdominis happens to be underneath. Here's the mechanism, step by step. The transverse abdominis wraps horizontally around your torso, and when it contracts, it draws your abdominal wall inward, increasing intra-abdominal pressure in a controlled, supportive way. This isn't the same as flexing your torso forward like a crunch. It's closer to the sensation of bracing before a heavy lift, or the natural tightening that happens when you cough or laugh hard without thinking about it. Properly training this muscle improves your body's ability to maintain that inward supportive tension throughout the day, not just during a specific dedicated exercise session. Here's why this matters so much as we age, and especially with prolonged sitting throughout the day. Chronic sitting and general inactivity are associated with reduced transverse abdominis activation and tone over time, since the muscle simply isn't being called upon regularly in most sedentary daily routines. Combined with the natural loss of muscle tone that comes with aging if it isn't actively maintained through deliberate training, this deep corset muscle often becomes one of the weakest, most undertrained parts of the entire midsection. Even in people who exercise regularly but focus heavily on visible, surface-level muscles instead of this deeper layer. This is where the specific exercise comes in, because a movement called the abdominal vacuum, along with properly performed planks, directly and specifically targets this deep muscle in a way crunches simply cannot replicate. Here's exactly what the habit looks like. Start either standing or on your hands and knees, whichever feels more stable and comfortable for you. Exhale completely, pushing all the air out of your lungs. Then, without inhaling, draw your belly button in and up, as if trying to touch it to your spine, hollowing out your entire abdominal area as much as possible. Hold this drawn in position for 15 to 20 seconds while breathing shallowly through your chest. Then release and breathe normally for a few breaths before repeating the sequence. Do this for a total of 5 sets, which takes about 5 minutes, including rest between each set. Research on this specific technique, often used in postpartum recovery programs targeting exactly this muscle after pregnancy, has shown it produces measurable increases in transverse abdominis thickness and activation, along with reported reductions in waist circumference over consistent practice, distinct from any general fat loss occurring alongside it. My tip: practice this in front of a mirror initially, since the correct sensation is subtle and it's easy to accidentally engage your rectus abdominis instead through a slight forward bend at the waist. You should feel a deep cinching sensation around your entire waist, not a bending or crunching sensation concentrated in your upper abdomen. Now, let's talk about the plank, because it works alongside the vacuum technique through a related but genuinely distinct mechanism worth understanding on its own. A properly performed plank, forearms and toes on the ground, body in a straight line from head to heels, requires sustained transverse abdominis engagement to maintain that neutral spine position under load throughout the entire hold. Unlike a crunch, which moves your spine through flexion repeatedly, a plank challenges your deep core to resist movement instead, which is actually closer to how your core muscles function during most real-world activities: standing, walking, lifting, where the actual job of your core is stabilization, not repeated bending back and forth. Research comparing plank training to traditional crunch training has shown planks produce significantly greater transverse abdominis activation, while crunches produce disproportionately more activation of the surface rectus abdominis, confirming that these two exercises genuinely target different layers of the same overall muscular system rather than simply being interchangeable core exercises. The recommendation here is building up to holding a proper plank for 30 to 60 seconds for 2 to 3 sets, focusing on quality of the brace rather than simply maximizing hold time with progressively worsening form as fatigue sets in. Tip: if your hips sag or pike up during a plank, you've lost proper core engagement, and continuing in that position mostly loads your lower back rather than your abdominal wall as intended. Better to hold correct form for 20 seconds than poor form for a full minute that isn't actually training the muscle you're trying to target. Now let's talk about a third exercise worth adding to this routine: the dead bug, since it adds a dynamic, controlled movement element that complements the more static vacuum and plank holds we've already discussed. Lying on your back, arms extended toward the ceiling and knees bent at 90 degrees, the dead bug involves slowly extending one arm overhead while simultaneously extending the opposite leg straight out, all while keeping your lower back pressed firmly into the floor throughout the entire movement. This requires the transverse abdominis to maintain that same protective bracing we discussed with the plank, but now while your limbs are moving, training your deep core to stabilize your spine during actual movement, which more closely mimics many real-world physical demands than a static hold alone. The recommendation here is 8 to 10 controlled repetitions per side for 2 to 3 sets, prioritizing keeping your lower back flat against the floor over how far you extend your limbs. Now, if you're finding this helpful, this is exactly the kind of thing I like breaking down on this channel, taking apart the actual mechanisms behind common fitness advice, not just repeating "do more crunches" without explaining why that often doesn't work the way people expect it to. So, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. Let's talk about diet and visible fat, because I want to be completely honest about something important here. No exercise, including the vacuum, planks, and dead bugs, will make your abdominal muscles visible if there's a significant layer of body fat covering them entirely. These techniques improve the tone, tightness, and functional support of your abdominal wall, which genuinely affects how flat your stomach looks and feels, independent of fat loss specifically. But visible muscle definition specifically requires an appropriate body fat percentage achieved through overall diet and activity patterns, not spot targeted exercise of any kind. This is one of the most persistent myths in fitness that you can spot reduce fat from a specific area through localized exercise alone. You cannot. Crunches, vacuums, and planks all strengthen and tone the abdominal region. But total body fat percentage is determined by your overall calorie balance and activity level, not by which specific muscle you happen to be exercising on any given day. Let's talk about posture too, since it connects directly to how your midsection appears throughout the day, independent of both exercise and fat loss entirely. Poor posture, particularly an anterior pelvic tilt, where your pelvis tips forward, pushes your abdominal contents forward and down, creating the appearance of a pooch even in people with a strong core and low body fat percentage. Strengthening your glutes and hip flexors alongside your transverse abdominis helps correct this postural pattern and can noticeably change how flat your stomach appears, simply through improved skeletal alignment rather than any change in muscle mass or fat. Let's talk about breathing patterns too, since chronic shallow chest-based breathing, common in people under regular stress, tends to underutilize the diaphragm and, by extension, underengages the transverse abdominis, which works closely with your diaphragm during proper healthy breathing mechanics. Practicing deep diaphragmatic breathing throughout the day, not just during dedicated exercise sessions, supports better baseline engagement of this same deep core system around the clock. Let's talk about hydration and bloating too, since these can significantly affect how flat your stomach appears day to day, independent of your actual muscle tone or fat percentage. Adequate water intake, along with managing sodium intake and identifying any specific food sensitivities you might have, can reduce temporary bloating that otherwise masks the very improvements you're working toward with this training, leading to unnecessary frustration when the training itself is actually working as intended. Let's talk timeline, because I want to be realistic here rather than promising instant transformation. Improved tone and a subjectively tighter feeling around your midsection is something many people notice within 1 to 2 weeks of consistent vacuum and plank practice, since it's largely a function of improved muscle activation and neuromuscular control, which responds relatively quickly to consistent, deliberate practice. Measurable changes in waist circumference, if they occur, tend to take 4 to 6 weeks of consistent practice combined with overall activity and diet to become clearly noticeable and measurable with a tape measure. This isn't a replacement for addressing overall body composition if visible fat loss is your primary goal here. And if you have any pelvic floor concerns, diastasis recti, or postpartum recovery needs specifically, work with a physical therapist who specializes in these techniques before starting on your own without guidance. Let me answer a few common questions, since I know these will come up. First, should I stop doing crunches entirely? Not necessarily. Crunches still have value for developing the rectus abdominis, which contributes to overall core strength and visible definition when body fat is low enough to reveal it. The point isn't that crunches are bad or should be eliminated, it's that relying on them exclusively while ignoring the transverse abdominis misses half of what actually creates a flat, well-supported midsection. Second, how is this different from just holding my stomach in throughout the day? Consciously holding your stomach in is actually a reasonable related practice, but the vacuum technique specifically trains the involuntary strength and endurance of that muscle over time, so that proper engagement becomes more automatic and effortless rather than requiring constant conscious effort throughout your entire day just to maintain it. Third, can this help with lower back pain too? Often, yes, since the transverse abdominis works alongside your deep spinal stabilizers to support your lower back during daily movement and lifting. Many people with chronic mild lower back discomfort related to weak core stabilization report improvement when they incorporate proper transverse abdominis training, though significant or persistent back pain should always be evaluated by a doctor or physical therapist first before starting any new exercise routine. Fourth, How does this compare to a Pilates class, since Pilates seems to emphasize similar deep core engagement? Good observation, and Pilates does indeed emphasize this same deep transverse abdominis engagement quite heavily, along with breath control, very similar to what we've discussed today. If you already enjoy Pilates, you're likely already training this muscle to some degree, and the specific vacuum and plank exercises we've covered here can be seen as a more targeted, minimal equipment complement to that broader practice rather than a replacement for it. So here's the bigger picture I want you to walk away with. This was never just about doing enough crunches or finding the perfect ab workout online. It's about a specific deep muscle, the transverse abdominis, that most traditional core exercises simply don't reach. And that muscle is what actually determines whether your midsection looks and feels flat, supported and cinched, or loose and pushed outward, regardless of the visible fat layer sitting above it. The vacuum technique, proper planks, dead bugs, good posture, and diaphragmatic breathing all work on different pieces of that same deep core system working together. Combine these consistently with an overall approach to body composition through diet and activity, and you're giving your body the actual foundation it needs for a genuinely flatter, more supported midsection, rather than just doing more of an exercise that was never designed to target this particular muscle in the first place. If you want to go deeper, my next video breaks down the exact core exercises that actually build visible ab definition once your body fat percentage is in the right range for that muscle to show through. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. I'll see you in the next one.